So hello, I'm Evan Cauter, and I will summarize for you a presentation that links sleeping and feeding and examines healthy and mostly unhealthy interactions. I am from the University of Chicago. In this presentation, we will focus on the role of insufficient sleep in the control of energy balance. Insufficient sleep is a novel behavior that has appeared in the past 20-30 years in industrialized countries all over the world. People are sleeping as little as possible in order to achieve as much as possible during waking hours. Insufficient sleep can affect both sides of energy balance. The first studies that examined the impact of insufficient sleep focused on energy intake, but there are also now more recent studies focusing on energy expenditure. The following slide will give you the main messages from this talk. Insufficient sleep has been shown to have an adverse impact on the hormonal regulation of hunger. Specifically, insufficient sleep increases hormones that promote appetite and hunger and decrease hormones that promote satiety. On the other hand, insufficient sleep then results in increased hunger and appetite and promotes what we call hedonic feeding, which is really feeding not for the purpose of maintaining energy balance, but for the purpose of the pleasure of eating or hedonic eating. A lot of the time this occurs under the forms of snacking. Lastly, insufficient sleep also impacts food preference. We will pick different kinds of foods to eat when we are sleep deprived as compared to fully rested. Amongst the first hormones that were examined in well-controlled studies where lean, healthy young people were studied in the laboratory under controlled conditions where they received the same amount and the same type of food and where they had the same amount of physical activity. The two hormones that were examined in the early studies and the two hormones for which subsequent studies have shown confirmation are leptin, which is a satiety factor, a hormone released by fat tissue, and when leptin levels are high, appetite is low. When leptin levels decrease, it's a powerful hunger signal. The other hormone that has been well examined is ghrelin. Ghrelin comes from stomach cells, and ghrelin is a powerful stimulant of appetite. When individuals are sleep restricted, they consistently report being more hungry and having more appetite than when they have longer time in bed. This slide in red shows you the ratings of hunger and appetite in subjects who had only 4 hours in bed for 2 days, as compared to when the same subject had only 10 hours in bed for 2 days. And the experimental conditions, except for sleep duration, were exactly the same under both sleep conditions. And what you can see is that the red curve is above the blue curve. For across the entire day, the ratings were given every hour on validating scale. On the next slide is an interesting result, which is that when the increase in the ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone, to leptin, which is the satiety hormone, is examined, it is strongly correlated with the increase in hunger. So the individuals who had the greatest increase in hunger had also the greatest increase in the hormonal ratio of hunger to satiety. So you can really measure in blood a correlation, a strong correlation with the increase in hunger as it results from sleep restriction. On this slide, we represent a typical experimental design, and this is a more recent study where the same individual participated in a randomized crossover design in a study with normal sleep as compared to a study with restricted sleep. Normal sleep was 8.5 hours in bed, and restricted sleep was 4.5 hours in bed. During the entire study, under both sleep conditions, they received the same amount and the same composition of food, and it's only on the last day at lunch that they received what we call an ad lib buffet, an assortment of palatable foods from which they could eat as much as they wanted. And the food was prepared by a hospital cafeteria, so it's not a high-class restaurant, but the foods were palatable and well prepared, and the volunteers could eat as much as they wanted over a 4-hour period, and the buffet was replenished twice. In the middle of the 2 meals, there were snacks. And the results of the study has actually been confirmed in different studies as well from other groups, is that the consumption of snacks was increased by 328 calories on average when the individuals had only 4.5 hours in bed as compared to when the same people had 8.5 hours in bed. Of note, the snacks were presented after the buffet lunch, and the volunteers under both sleep conditions overate a lot from the buffet lunch, probably because it was a nice distraction from the food previously offered in this hospital study. But despite eating almost 2,000 calories at the lunch buffet, they still, when they were sleep restricted, overate more snacks in the subsequent hours. The difference of nearly 300 calories with sleep restrictions has been confirmed in other studies and would certainly lead to weight gain under chronic conditions. A more chronic study, where instead of looking at 4 hours of sleep extension versus sleep restriction, we're looking here at 2 weeks, 13 days in the laboratory. And here the volunteers had access to snacks, which were presented in a sort of minibar in their room without alcohol, of course. And you can see the red curve is the amount of calories they consumed from snacks when they had 5.5 hours in bed, and the blue curves is when they had 8.5 hours in bed. And you can see that throughout the study, the red curve, which is the curve corresponding to sleep restriction, is generally higher than the blue curve. On average, over a 2-week period, the participant ate 221 calories more per day when they were sleep restricted to 5.5 hours in bed as compared to rested with 8.5 hours in bed. Of note, 5.5 hours in bed is not an unusual bedtime duration for weekdays in many people. In the United States, more than 30% of the population sleeps less than 6 hours per night during work days. So this is really showing that sleep restriction can lead to excess caloric intake, particularly from snacks, and the excess amount is certainly sufficient to lead to weight gain. Not only does the amount of food intake increase in a state of sleep debt, but the type of food that are preferred also changes. And this slide represents the change from the food preference when fully rested, the increase in craving for that particular amount of food in a state of sleep debt. What you can see is that consistently across studies, it is salty foods that people crave the most. While they may not have had much of a liking for salty food when they were well rested, the increase in this particular study was 45%. The salty foods were described as potato chips, pretzels, but also olives and pickles. The next food category to be increased by about 33% are sweets, including cake and candy, and starchy food, including bread and pasta. Other food categories were also increased, but not to the same extent. The most important changes were salty foods, sweets, and starchy foods. Insufficient sleep can also affect the other part of energy balance, energy expenditure. First of all, to stay awake longer takes some energy. And one can wonder, how much energy am I spending by staying awake in front of my computer for 3 more hours instead of being asleep in bed? Well, unfortunately, the caloric cost of extended wakefulness is very small. It's about 17 calories per hour. A small cookie will just pay for 3 hours of extended wakefulness. So the upregulation of food intake and appetite is much, much in excess of the caloric need of the extended wakefulness. On the other side, there is also the fact that people who have insufficient sleep tend to be sleepy and tired and fatigued, and therefore they also move less. And there are laboratory studies showing that even under sedentary conditions, when participants have had insufficient sleep, they have less energy expenditure. And there is also studies to indicate that people who are habitual short sleepers tend to go less to the gym and move around less, and therefore overall have a positive energy balance. Thank you for your attention.